Welcome to our Friday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. This week I've started a series that I've entitled Discover the Keys to Staying Full of God. This is a 195-page book, and we're offering this for a gift of any amount. You know, we have some people that won't send whatever the suggested donation is, and I'll send it to you anyway, but we want you to give something because we'll put out tens of thousands of these. And so we ask you to give something. For those who could not or would not give anything, I'll give you this little booklet entitled 4 Keys to Staying Full of God. And this is just a condensed version of this larger book. And then we have CDs, DVDs, USB, and even a study guide that you could get. And I tell you what I've been talking about is I just love this. This is something that has changed my life. This is how I live. This is literally the way that I deal with every single thing in my life. And so I've said a lot. There's no way I can go back and summarize everything, but let me just say that I'm teaching out of Romans 1:21, and it says, "Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened." And so he had just said in verses 18 through 20 that everybody at one time knew God. God put a homing device, an intuitive knowledge of Him and of right and wrong in every person's heart. That's what those verses are saying. But the rest of Romans 1 shows you that you can deaden yourself to it. You can turn away from God, and you can get to where this conscience that He put on the inside of us it literally becomes seared like with a hot iron, 1 Timothy chapter 4, and you become deadened so that you can go out and live in sin and get to where you say you're an atheist or an agnostic and you actually go to believing it. But nobody starts that way. You had a sensitivity to God at one time, but you can deaden yourself to it, and this shows us 4 progressive steps. The one that I've been talking about yesterday was the first thing you have to do to harden yourself towards God and to what He's done in your life is you have to quit glorifying Him as God. And the word glorify means to render or esteem glorious. I looked up each one of those words, and the word esteem is talking about the value that you place on something. So this is what I was talking about yesterday. That when the Lord first really revealed Himself to me, I got born again at 8 years old. But I was truly born again because I remember in the 3rd grade, I was different the next day. And my friend said, "What happened to you?" And I told him I got born again. And I had my friends in the 3rd grade make fun of me for being a Christian. So there was a change that took place. But I went to church and I became religious, and I became a religious Pharisee. But then 10 years later, when I was 18, I had an encounter with God that I just hadn't got time to explain about it. It's so awesome in my life. I could talk about this all day long, but I had this encounter, and I just fell in love with God. I became a stark, raving, mad fanatic overnight, and I was willing to do anything for the Lord after I encountered Him that way. And so I got up in front of my Baptist church and told people. The pastor came against me and tried to get me to value his opinion. Yesterday I was sharing like a seesaw. Some people call it a teeter-totter, that if you put value on God up here and everybody else is down here, but when people come out and criticize you, the tendency is for you to value their opinion, and the moment you start valuing them, you start devaluing what God has done. The key to keeping everything as strong as it was the moment God touched you is you just place such value on God that nobody else ever compares. I had my mother, I had family members, I had the people in the church come against me. And I'm not saying I did everything right. I mean, I was 18 years old. I don't know that I was saying and acting properly, but man, nonetheless, I had people attack me and tell me I had lost my mind. And my tendency was to value their opinion. If I had valued them, that would have automatically devalued what God had done, and I would have lost the joy and the blessing of it. But you know what? I have never lost my joy and my thankfulness and my appreciation for what God did in my life, March the 23rd, 1968, because I have never let anybody else even compete with the value that I place on God and His love and His acceptance of me. Man, that's awesome. You know, the very first thing that happened when I had this experience with the Lord, I was in my first year of college, and I just fell in love with God, and I fell out of love with everything else. I was planning on becoming a school teacher. That's what everybody in my family had done. So I was in my first year of college, and I was just taking the necessary courses. And I got to where I hated college. Prior to that, my mother had moved to Durant, Oklahoma, and she was getting a master's degree. So I was actually living by myself in the home that I grew up in, but I was living by myself. I only saw my mother on weekends. And I was just having a great time being my first year in college, out on my own, and I was loving it. But when I had this encounter with the Lord, I lost interest in anything except God. And so immediately, I just quit going to school. I was witnessing to people. I was talking to people about the Lord. I didn't have time to go to college. And so I just decided after a week or so of that I was going to quit school. I just lost any desire to be in college. Well, my mother and everybody else that I knew told me I was crazy because I was getting $350 a month from the government if I stayed in school. That was a Social Security benefit from my father's death. And as long as I stayed in school, I got this money from the government. I had a student deferment from the draft. This is before the lottery system was put in place. And as long as I stayed in school, I wouldn't be drafted. And I had the acceptance of people. But when I said that I was going to quit school, man, the feathers hit the fan. I mean, immediately everybody began to tell me, you're crazy. And see, here I was glorifying God, and I was just so in love with the Lord that I just wanted God. I didn't care anything about what a secular education could benefit me. And other people came along and started criticizing me, and what Satan was trying to do was get me to value their opinion. If I had done that, I would have devalued what God was speaking to me and saying, and I would have eventually lost the joy and the blessing of that encounter with the Lord. But I just was able to continue to glorify God and to put Him up there. And even though these were people that were very influential in my life, I didn't value anybody's opinion even close to what I valued God. And so it's a long story, but I eventually decided that this was God. It wasn't just my desires. It was God telling me to quit school. And so I did. And when I made that decision and quit school, I mean, a lot of things started happening. I immediately lost money from the government. I was immediately sent a pre-induction physical notice, and I had to go and take a physical to see if I was fit for the Army. And that was the first step to being drafted. And but I was just in love with the Lord. And anyway, I had this recruiter from the Army come to my house. And this guy was probably in his 30s. I was 18, or maybe by this time I might have turned 19. That was just a month after I had this encounter with the Lord. And anyway, I was 18 or 19 years old. This 30-year-old Army recruiter comes to my house. He opens up his briefcase. He puts out all of his brochures, and he starts telling me all of the benefits of joining the Army versus being drafted. And I just stopped him, and I said, I can save both of us a lot of time. And he said, how's that? And I said, the reason that you're here and the reason I went for this pre-induction physical is because I quit school and I lost my deferment. And he said, that's right. And I said, but God told me to quit school. And when I said God told me to quit school, I could see this smirk come on this guy's face like, oh, who's God compared to the U.S. government? And so I told this recruiter, I said, God's the one that told me to quit school, so therefore it's in God's hands whether or not I get drafted or not. And this guy broke out laughing. And he looked at me and he said, boy, I can guarantee you are going to Vietnam. Now, you know what was taking place? I was valuing God and thinking that I'm doing what God tells me to do, so therefore I don't care about what the consequences are. I didn't consider anything else. Here comes a recruiter trying to get me to value his opinion. He was a representative of the United States government, and he was thinking that who's God compared to the U.S. government? See, he valued the government. He valued these natural things, and and devalued God. I was just the opposite. I had a choice. Was I going to be fearful? Was I going to be bothered by what he had to say? And if I did, I would have immediately decreased the value I put on what God told me to do. Or was I going to continue to value God? And again, I'm not claiming great wisdom or anything, but I was just so passionate about what God had done in my life that when this guy mocked God and said, boy, I can guarantee you, you're going to Vietnam. When he said that to me, it made me mad. He did not value God the way that I did. And I remember standing up and putting my fist in my finger in his chest, and I said, buddy, God's the one that told me to quit school, so therefore I am under God's leading, and whatever God wants will come to pass. If He wants me to go to Vietnam, I'll go to Vietnam, and if He doesn't, you are the United States government, and every demon in hell cannot draft me. That's exactly word for word what I told this guy. And this guy never said a word. He didn't even respond. He just got his brochures, put them in his briefcase, and left. Never said a word. And did you know it was the very next day I got my draft notice in the mail. And back then, I didn't think of looking to see if there was a stamp on it. I think that guy may have gone and processed my papers and have put that in my mailbox himself just to show me that, who's God compared. But I didn't care because, man, I meant every word that I said. And when I got drafted and sent to Vietnam, I trusted God. God supernaturally protected me. I could have been killed easily 3 or 4 times. And I was just in a bubble in Vietnam. In hindsight, looking at it, going to Vietnam is one of the best things that happened, because when I went to Vietnam, I was a Baptist and I didn't ever intend on changing. But in Vietnam, there was just so much pull towards temptation, and there was so much ungodliness around me that in order to survive, I just had to stick my nose in the Bible and read. And I read the Bible anywhere from 10 to 15 hours a day. And then I pulled bunker guard every night, and I would pray for 4 hours on bunker guard. So I was spending, 15, 16, 17 hours a day praying and studying the Word. And I didn't intend to change, but when I got into the Word, I came back and the Baptists didn't want me anymore. I was believing in the baptism of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, miracles. I wasn't seeing those things happen, but I was believing in them because I'd read it in the Word, and it didn't conform to Baptist doctrine, and so they asked me to leave. And in hindsight, it was good. And did you know, this goes along also with this same thing, that you have to render and esteem God glorious, more important, more valuable than anything else. And during my time in Vietnam, I tell you, I was in situations where other people, I don't mean this as criticism. I'm not sure. My 2 sons, I remember when I was 20 when I went to Vietnam. I turned my 21st birthday in Vietnam. And I remember looking at them when they were 20 years old and thinking, could they stand against the things that happened to me in Vietnam? And I don't think that they could have, because they hadn't had that experience that I'd had. But because I had just been caught up in the love of God, it was like I was in a bubble. And I became a chaplain's assistant, and the chaplain one time flew out to this LZ Prep. It was just a temporary fire support base that they had mortars and 155s and things like that mounted in a very small space, just like it wasn't even 100 yards long. It's probably 50 yards wide. And there was 120 people in that area. And they were up there firing these ammunitions and stuff to support the troops that were out in the field. And so anyway, this was in a really bad situation. You could see the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You could see the Laotian border. We were just nearly into Lagos. And So anyway, it was a bad situation, and I flew in with the chaplain, and the chaplain basically went out there to administer last rites to these guys because many of them were going to be killed. And so we went out there, and while I was there, I forget the exact length of time, but it was only 3, 4, 5 hours, something like that. We took 120 mortars inside of our perimeter. And we had these connex or cone things that could withstand a mortar, but you had to, every time you heard one coming in, you had to dive inside of there. And anyway, people were dying all around me. You could see the muzzle fire from the Vietnamese as they were coming up the hill. And the reason I'm telling this story is to say that I was just so in love with the Lord that I was just, it's like Paul said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. I had figured that the only way I could ever really maintain the joy that I had felt was just to go to be with the Lord. And so I actually had spent time saying, God, I'm ready to go. I'm ready for you to take me to the Lord. And instead of being terrified by all of the stuff that was going on, I actually was excited. And I was thinking, man, I could see Jesus before sunset today. And while mortars were coming in, people were dying. I could see the muzzle fire from them coming up the hill. I had my M16 pointed down the hill, and I didn't fire because they were so far away. Would have just been a shot in the dark, but I would have defended myself. I didn't have a death wish, but I just was so enveloped in the love of God that I was actually rejoicing during all of this. And I actually found myself thinking, God, if I die, I know where I'm going. But what about these Vietnamese? They don't know you. And I had love and compassion flowing out of me. I was praying for these Vietnamese that I had my M16 pointed at, and I was praying for them. And because I was with the chaplain, they took the chaplain out because they valued him more than the rest of the troops. And since I was with the chaplain, they took us out. We had rounds hit our chopper as we were evacuated out of there. And that hill was overrun, and I think all but, I don't remember the exact number, but just a handful, 2, 3, 4 people survived that. Everybody else was killed just moments after we left. And anyway, the reason I bring that up is to say that most people would say, well, man, you couldn't just keep valuing God if somebody's trying to kill you, if you're in a war situation. Well, I did. And you know, actually 20 years after I had been in Vietnam, I had a man give me a book. And there were 12 stories in this book. And it won a Pulitzer Prize because it was well written. And anyway, he had his testimony in there and he wanted me to read it. And it was 20 years after I'd been in Vietnam, and I had no desire to read anything about Vietnam, but I knew this guy would ask me if I'd read his testimony, so I said, I'll read it. So I read his testimony in there, and it was powerful. And I just started reading others, and I wound up staying up all night long and read the entire book. And 3 of those people in those 12 testimonies were there at the same time I was, and one of them was in the same division I was in, and he was talking about his LZ, or landing zones, what they called it, a fire support base, being overrun and them taking the chaplain out. And I don't know for sure because he didn't give all the information, but it could have been the exact time that I was there. He could have been writing about the exact place that I was. It was the same time, and it was the same 𝗲𝗏 division. And anyway, as I read that book 20 years after, did you know that fear came upon me when I was reading it through the eyes of an unbeliever? Because he was describing how terrifying it was. He described the smells. And I mean, I had like a flashback. And 20 years after being there, I experienced the fear that I probably would have experienced when I was there if I hadn't had my mind stayed upon the Lord. And I had to stay up and get my mind back upon the Lord and pray in tongues and get my emotions back in the right place. But it's just like the Lord pulled back the curtain for just a moment and let me see what it would have been like if I hadn't just been in this bubble of God's love. And I know that many of the people listening to me think that, well, you're weird. But you know, I think you're weird to have this available and to have God in love with us so much so that He died for us. He left the Holy Spirit. God is passionate about us, and He loves us, and yet we let the criticism of somebody else devalue God, and we get to where we want their acceptance more. We let things like financial problems and stuff bother us. I mean, I believe that God can supply our needs and give us breakthroughs in the area of finances, but if nothing ever happened, you're going to live in a mansion forever. You ought to be glorifying that, see, and putting value on that. And if we really just thought according to the Word of God, it'd be like Paul, for me to live is Christ. So if I live, man, I'm just going to be worshiping the Lord. But if I die, if I never got healed of this thing, I'm going to go be with the Lord. I'm not going to let sickness, poverty, people's criticism, somebody trying to kill me is not going to take my attention off of the Lord. And I tell you, I went through Vietnam like that, and God just supernaturally protected me. I could give you other instances where the chaplain and I were driving by ourselves out in the bush where they were told us not to go, but you don't tell the chaplain not to do something. And we came to a place where there was a number of Vietnamese soldiers, North Vietnamese soldiers, Viet Cong, that were there with their AK-47 and our Jeep. I was driving the Jeep. We came up to them and they saw us because they just parted and let us drive right through. I don't know how in the world we kept from being killed in that situation. But God just, I'm telling you that when you are in the presence of the Lord and when you are glorifying God, everything else works better. And you're just too late to tell me that it can't work. And so I'm saying through this that God has revealed Himself to every single person watching this. If you aren't basking in the love of the Lord, either you've never received it, you've never been born again, and you can do that. We'll put a number on the screen and you can call and you can be born again. Or if you were born again, you have the love of God on the inside of you. You have the fullness of the Godhead in you bodily. Is what it says in Colossians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And now that Godhead is in us. We've got all of these glories and things. And if you aren't experiencing it, it's not because God isn't giving, it's because we have valued something else. The opinion of somebody else, the circumstance that we're in, we're looking with negative unbelief at the potential of what's going to come instead of looking through faith. But it's up to you. You can be as full of God as you want to be. You can start glorifying God and go back and just remember the goodness of God. And I guarantee you it'll help you overcome any rejection, anything that's going on in your life. There is nothing the devil or people are doing to you that even compares with what God has done for you. Hello, this is Andrew Wommack, and if you've enjoyed our program there on YouTube, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Share this with other people because, man, these truths will set people free. So check it out, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.